Thanks. Well, thanks. Nice to be here. Thanks for asking me to speak. A bit like headache researchers talking to patient groups is a bit like reporting to the schoolmaster, so to speak, or teacher. You might think of it the other way, probably, but it is that way, really. You should think of it that way, because our purpose is to deal with your problems, not create. Unfortunately, sometimes we meaning that, I hope not me, but broadly speaking, sometimes make things worse. I was asked to talk about what research reveals about the nature of migraine. I'm going to cover some things. Here we are. So I'll keep an eye on the time. I don't use the term migraine disease. I think it's a tautology. I'm sorry. I realise it's politically correct. I have no interest in political correctness at all. I never have. It's a signature of my career, because I think migraine is a disease and that's the end of it. And so the rest of it, I wouldn't add more words, but that's a personal opinion. You're welcome to say whatever you like. So migraine's one of these are the headache disorders from something called the International Classification of Headache Disorders. It's free on the International Headache Society's website. It's a romping good 160-page read, a 200-page read, bedtime read, most of which probably wouldn't interest you. And the way we think about headache disorders is to think about them in terms of whether they're primary or secondary. I realise some of what I'm going to say, there'll be people online or some people in the room who know it or know what I'm going to say at any rate, and that's the purpose of the questions. So if some of what I say seems a little simplistic, then just bear with us till the questions. I thought I'd sort of start with some level setting. We think of, there are a collection of diseases that are described as primary headache disorders, where the headache is part of a collection of symptoms that is there without any external effect, you might say. If I contrast that to the secondary headache disorders, the obvious one there was just trauma to the head. So if someone comes along and hits you with a stick in the head, big stick, you'll get pain in the head. It's a secondary headache. If you have a tumour or an infection, you get pain in the head for various reasons. While that's important, and many of my colleagues are very excited by it, I'm not particularly interested, because it's sort of obvious if you belt someone in the head, they're going to have a sore head. So what? Primary headache disorders are really quite interesting if you think about them. I realise if you've got it, it's interesting may not be the word, but because you get the problem without any particularly good reason for it, if I could say it that way. There's nothing obvious going on. That's why they're called primary. And the number one of the primary headache disorders in the ICHD is migraine, because that's the commonest cause of disability in the world due to a headache disorder. That wasn't known when the system got set up in the 1980s, actually. I think it was fortuitous. The other ones I'm not going to talk about, although I'd be happy to talk about any of them, really. Tension-type headache is... I don't know anyone I respect who can put a evidence-based sentence together on the subject of tension-type headache. I think it's just a mess. And part of the reason is the way the classification has messed it up. There are other forms of headache. I'm quite interested in cluster headache. I don't know if anyone is online who has cluster. There'll be cluster headache patients somewhere in New Zealand, I can almost guarantee it. And there are cluster headache groups throughout the world. I'd be happy to talk about any of these conditions. You can see that by the time we got to section 4, the classification committee had a complete lack of creativity, and we just called everything else other, which is a little unhelpful in many ways. Most of that is fairly obvious. If you have headache when you cough, it's called cough headache. It's not quite right. It's called Valsalva. It's Valsalva manoeuvres. That's like coughing or lifting like that, any sort of strain, unless you're sort of going under section 4.3, where we very specifically call that out as a sexual activity headache, for fairly obvious reasons, I suppose. And there are two forms of that, and I can talk about that in as much detail as you can tolerate. It has to be said. I've run into some patients over the years who've described lots of interesting things to me around that. They're mutually exclusive, cough, headache and sex headache, interesting enough. You can get headache from exercise, just a featureless headache from exercise, but it doesn't count if you're exercising in section 4.3. Thunderclap headache comes on like that. Cold stimulus headache is what happens when you walk outside today, I guess. That's a bit cool. You get cold, or if you stick something cold in your mouth. The Americans call it ice cream headache. External compression headache is if you put a band around your head and you tighten it. It's not clear why you would want to do that, but that's a recognised thing, and the treatment is very effective. You loosen the band. You do very well, that has to be said. I wonder why we put this in here. Stabbing headache, it just stabs like that. Many of you who have migraine will also have, from time to time, sudden stabs or jabs in the head, comes out of nowhere. Don't know why it happens. It can be really awfully painful and it's gone. It's called primary stabbing headache. Nummular headache is headache that looks like it's coin-shaped. And hypnic headache is headache that happens when you go to sleep. And eudatic persistent headache starts from one day to the next. I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about migraine. The classification is actually quite useful. I'll come to the criteria in a second, but it's widely used. I mean, actually, better to say globally used, because all of the authorities that are involved in regulating medicines or regulating healthcare everywhere in the world use the same classification, being translated into 30-odd languages. It's the People's Republic of China and Taiwan both use that classification. The Ukrainians and the Russians both use that classification. The people in Israel, Lebanon and Palestine, if I may use that term, all use that classification. We've done better in headache than most governments have done in terms of getting sort of general agreement. And that means that the work that's done anywhere in the world, you can understand how it can be applied in other parts of the world, because we've standardised the way that we do the studies. And that's actually extremely useful. It means that studies that are done, for example, in North America or in the Czech Republic, in the generality of things, are as useful in Auckland as they are in Prague. And that's important. It also means you're not alone. There's 1 billion or more of you. Frightening number when you think about it. I noticed if there's 1 million people affected by neurologic disorders in this country, 3/4 of them must be migraine by my calculation. So you guys win but it's not something you want to win, I'm going to guess. So I wanted to say a few things about one of the things we've begun to understand very well is the broader nature of the attack, is the way I probably want to say this. So on the left, I have a description of a migraine attack. Well, I have the things that happen in a migraine attack, a laundry list of things that happen in a migraine attack. And on the right, I have some things about migraine, you might say the disease or the disorder, because people with migraine have migraine. Migraine is the disorder of having migraine, so to speak. The word's used in two ways. And just because all your attacks every day aren't typically migraine doesn't mean you got new parents. Your biology doesn't change more or less on a day-to-day basis. We use some definitions which don't make a lot of sense, don't make any sense to me, and I was involved in deriving them, I can tell you. This business of episodic and chronic migraine, if you wonder where we got 15 from, it's half of 30. That's it. That is it. It's the only thing the committee could agree on. It's half of 30. It's really embarrassing. As I've said before many times, the only guy who had any brains in the room, I suspect, was the German chap, Christoph Diener, who asked what we were going to do with February. And we haven't managed to answer that question in 20 years. It's embarrassing. I think it's a useless terminology, but actually the reason that it's come to capture us is because governments, rightly or wrongly, governments believe this classification system, and so governments will very often insist on data for episodic and chronic migraine and prescription for episodic and chronic migraine. So if you wonder where it comes from, it doesn't make any sense, but sometimes you've got to live with the rules, you know. If you're going to play tennis, you've got to hit the ball over the net, it's got to get in with the lines. You can't argue with the umpire. You can try, but you'll always lose. So it is what it is. Just live with it. Family history is important in migraine. Most people who have migraine will have a first-degree relative, mother, father, brother or sister, someone in the family who'll have migraine. And, you know, if one of the parents don't have migraine, a good place to look for the culprit would be dad's mum, because males manifest the disorder much less than females do. So you can sometimes trace it through dad's mum. Fundamentally, migraine is a disorder that's almost certainly inherited in some way. We've done very badly at sorting out the genetics of that, very badly. We've got lots of things that point in various directions, more than 100 of them, but really haven't sorted that out in any useful fashion. That said, we think that's where the disorder starts in most people. I'm going to say some specific things about triggering, because very often people are asking about triggering. These are some of the things that are triggers, you might say, and they speak to what the sort of lifestyle advice that we generally give, which I suggest people need: regular sleep, regular meals and regular exercise. And I try to ignore that advice myself as much as I possibly can, although recently I've been better at doing regular exercise. Alcohol will trigger migraine, nitroglycerin will trigger migraine. Weather's a funny thing, we don't really understand that, and I'm going to come back to some of these other so-called triggers. Certainly the variations in the menstrual cycle will trigger migraine. We understand that reasonably well in terms of hormonal change, although that's vastly under-researched, I think. So if I go to the other side, we spent a lot of time on what are called the canonical symptoms. These are the symptoms that are used for clinical trials. So the pain of migraine should be one-sided, should be pounding or throbbing, and it should be worsened with physical activity. Most people with migraine will not get up and run about the countryside or beat their head against the wall. They won't do that. That's a bad idea. 90% rule. An important rule about migraine is there is no absolute rule. All of these things vary. It's what's called syndromic. So you can have bits of it. I see plenty of people with headache on both sides of their head that doesn't throb but is aggravated by movement, for example. And I'm quite happy to call it migraine. The other thing that you should have, although obviously this is not what you want to have, but from a clinical perspective is what you do have, is nausea. Some people get a bonus, they vomit, lucky them. Luckily, that's not the majority. And then there's these what are called sensory sensitivities, which are at the core of migraine and really differentiated from tension-type headache. So light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, it's called phonophobia. Light's called photophobia. Smell sensitivity, I graded out because it's not in the ICHD classification. That's probably a mistake. It's quite specific to migraine, so sensitive to smells. Sensitive to light touch, something called allodynia, discomfort from a non-painful stimulus. So those of you who normally, I'd say hair, but I'm trying to find where my hair is. It's a little bit back here. Those of you who might have pain from brushing the hair when you have an attack, that's called allodynia. And then there's dizziness. Vertigo, the illusory sense of movement, which is very common in migraine. Probably half of people who have migraine will have some sense of this. And very often we'll describe that as vestibular migraine. I'm not sure that's a wonderful term, but it's a popular term and it helps the ENT folks focus. The message in migraine is that migraine is a disorder of the way the brain deals with its environment, deals with incoming information. That's why it's complex, because all of the senses, light, touch, sound, smell, sound, they're all affected at some level and variously. And we haven't understood why some people, for example, would need to wear dark glasses all the time, and some people, light doesn't bother them at all. It's extraordinary, the variability. Before the attack comes, you can start to get sensations of it, often days beforehand, sometimes just hours beforehand, where you don't feel quite right and maybe you're off your game a bit, you can't quite concentrate. Maybe you feel fatigued or you want to sleep, you yawn. If you yawn, about 90% chance you'll go on and have a migraine. It's a very reliable, what's called premonitory or prodromal symptom. You might pass more urine. It's not the sort of question neurologists usually ask. You know, it's one of the reasons I got into neurology, because you don't have to deal with any of the, downstairs stuff, so to speak. But passing more urine is a common premonitory symptom. Food cravings, I think that accounts for some of this food trigger nonsense. People take some food and they get their attack, and it's more of a triggering a triggering thing. And some people with migraine will have some sniffliness or eye watering, a bit of tearing, and I feel a bit flushed. They're called cranial autonomic symptoms, and they very often, in many places, will lead to ENT people or people thinking they've got allergies and sticking stuff up their nose and so forth, for which no particular useful thing will come. One of the frustrations, I suspect, that very often people with migraine will talk about is this idea, you go to a neurologist, if you can find one. I'm told that's a bit of a problem in New Zealand. It's a problem all over the world, it has to be said. Either you find one you don't like or you can't find one at all. There doesn't seem to be any happy balance in that. And the neurologist might examine you and tell you that you're normal. Well, you probably don't feel normal when you have an attack. It's a sort of word that we bandy about. Then you might get a brain scan and they'll cheerfully tell you that your brain scan is normal. You shouldn't be disappointed by that, because in neurology, if your brain scan's not normal, that's bad. One of two things will happen. Either you've got something growing, in which case you want to get on a boat, take a trip, enjoy what you've got left, or you'll have some sort of brain rot for which there's no treatment altogether. So having a normal scan might seem like a bad idea, but I can tell you it's a good idea, a really, really good idea. Now, the frustration is that these scans that we do are structural. It's like looking at a car. Look at, say, a Ferrari out the front, and it looks quite cool, but if it's got no petrol, it's not going anywhere. It's not functioning at all. And the problem with migraine is not that the structure's wrong, but the way it works. It doesn't work properly, if I can say it that way. And functional imaging, which is these examples of, have been very good, I think, to migraine in this regard, where we've been able to trigger attacks with nitroglycerin. 4 out of 5 people with migraine will have their attack triggered if you infuse something called nitroglycerin. It's usually used for cardiac heart problems. And you can then have the person in the scan and you can see what their brain is doing differently compared to people who you give nitroglycerin to who don't get migraine. And at the top there, the top 3 scans were done with a radioactive tracer called 15 labelled water. It's a positron tracer. And what it shows is little blobs in the brain, and they're little blobs of areas that are behaving in a way that the control scan is not. They're the consequence of the function change that's happening in the earliest part of the attack. And you can see it, and it's quite reproducible. This is the first of the things that were done. Farouk Maniar, when we were in San Francisco, led on this. Others have done the same sort of scanning in different ways and come to the same sort of conclusions, that these areas of the brain are quite robust. So it's not that when people do a scan that if there's nothing going on in your brain, it's simply they don't see it with static imaging, and you can't do it. We don't have a good enough resolution of these scans yet to be able to do it on a single basis. So you need maybe, for a PET, you need half a dozen people to be 6 to 8 participants to be able to show what's going on. But rest assured, it's crystal clear and it's reproduced many times over that when something's happening in your migraine, there are things that are going on in your brain. Now, happily, the hypothalamus is an area that is involved in controlling many things. It has influences into something called the limbic system, mood. It has influences on passing urine. It has influences on food triggering. It has influences on pain. It has influences on circadian rhythm, which is involved in sleep. And sleep problems can be such a torture for people with migraine. So these areas of the brain that are active make sense in terms of the type of symptoms that you have, and you could be. It's not that I shouldn't have to say this to you. It's not like you make them up. Not crazy people. They're just difficult to. They're just being difficult to capture. At the bottom scans with the red ones, Nazia Cars, and this is work we've done at King's using something called arterial spin labelling. It's an MR technique, so it doesn't have radiation, so you can do many scans over. And we were interested in the very relatively simple question of, if you have a preventive, does that change the way the brain responds to these triggers? And the answer, unsurprisingly perhaps, is yes, it does. So you can manipulate that. You could start to get a biomarker, if you like, a way of measuring something when a person is on a preventive. Now, I want to say something specific about triggering, and I'll use this as an example. These are two studies published by Farouk when we were in San Francisco. The one on the and what we did was take people who we could trigger their attacks, and we could look at their symptoms in the premonitory phase. That's before you get pain, because the problem with pain, I understand it's unpleasant, but the problem with pain sort of intellectually and from a research perspective is it influences so many things. It sort of messes scans up a little bit. So it's quite helpful to be able to look at things happening in the brain without the problem of having pain. And on the left is, and these are all comparisons. So what we did was take people who we triggered and had their premonitory symptoms, and some of them would have nausea before the pain, and some wouldn't. And you subtract the two scans and you ask yourself the question, what's the difference in their brain? And the little blob at the bottom on the left-hand scan is an area of the brain that's involved, unsurprisingly, in throwing up and nausea, because these people had nausea. It's not all that surprising, although it's quite reassuring that if you say you're nauseated and you do this type of scanning, you can show parts of the brain that we know to already be involved in nausea. On the right-hand side is the same thing but done with light. So what we did was subtract the scans and show there's the back of the brain there where that little yellow part is on the right-hand blob is the vision area, the visual cortex. So it's not entirely surprising that if someone's got light sensitivity that their visual cortex is overactive. But it goes to show you that it's not like a construct you just dream up or some nonsense idea. It's very, very concrete if you can get the right technology to measure it. And it has an implication, I think, and there's a broad implication, and it's in the middle panel of this. It's the business of triggers versus premonitory symptoms. I don't think for a moment what I'm about to say is an explanation for all triggers, but I do think it's an explanation for some things. One of the things we're interested in is asking people, okay, tell me what triggers your migraine. Many will say light. Light's a trigger. Bright lights are a trigger. And then you talk about the actual attack just before the attack. Tell me about your premonitory symptoms. Light sensitivity is very common. And in this study, about 3/4 said both. And I'll put it to you that what sometimes is regarded as a trigger is simply the premonitory symptom before the headache. So if you're sensitive to light, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours later you get a headache, you might think, oh, well, you notice the light, you get a headache, you notice the light, you get a headache, you notice the light, you get a headache. You do that 500 times, you think, well, okay, light must be triggering headache. Unless you realise that the attack could be already started, and you could be noticing lights and sensitive to light and so on, because actually your attack starts long before the headache starts in this thing called the premonitory phase. And I think it accounts for some of the things, some of the frustration, say with food triggering, where people will notice something. Chocolate's the classic one where this has happened. And what's happening is they're being driven by parts of the brain that are quite primitive, and I don't mean that you're primitive people, but there are parts of the brain that look after things like when you need to eat, when you need to pass urine, drive you to sleep, and so they all drive your heart to make sure it keeps going. So all of that stuff we evolved over many, many years. And when they don't work properly, then they drive you to do things that you don't really need to do as such. I'll say a few words about understanding of migraine aura, because that's that little thing that's happening is what's called a cortical spreading depression in a brain. It's a cat brain, actually. One of my colleagues, Andy Parsons, gave me that a long time ago. So people who have aura have this flashing, most of them, 90%, have this little flashing twiggly thing, usually straight lines, off in the periphery, and it grows, and sometimes it leaves some of the vision black behind it. And that can be imaged quite clearly. It was first imaged in the 1980s by Olson on the left-hand side in that coloured panel, showing changes in brain blood flow that are happening in the vision part of the brain and moving across the brain. And you can do other sorts of fancy things. Hajikani and Moskowitz did this with something called functional imaging using bold imaging to do it. It's quite clear that phenomenon of visual aura, again, can be imaged and then can be taken into experimental animals to be better understood. One last thing I want to say is about how to understand pain a little bit. This is just the structure of pain. So one of the interesting things about the brain is it's largely insensate. You can poke around in it as the surgeons do, and they don't poke around meaninglessly, of course they're poking around very carefully, but it doesn't cause pain. What's painful in the head is the covering of the brain. It's called the dura, and if you tug on it, as surgeons do from time to time, sometimes when they're doing operations, they'll be removing a tumour and they'll open the head up under local anaesthetic, and then they'll be removing the tumour, and they need to know that they're not causing any trouble, so they get a person to speak or move their hand and so forth, so you're actually conscious. And if you tug on the dura mater, this covering, then people will say it's painful or uncomfortable, but they won't say you're tugging on my dura. You've got no word for that. You don't even know what that's not a thing. What everyone does is refer the pain out. So if you're tugging on the top of the dura, they'll talk about the pain being out here in what's called the trigeminal distribution. It's what's called referred pain, because there's no point knowing your dura is being tugged on, because normally you don't have your skull open, you can't do anything about it. It's a warning system. The back of the information from the back does the same sort of thing in the brain. They both go to the same place in the brain. It's called the trigeminocervical complex. And the reason that sometimes it's a bit vague, or it changes around, or moves here or moves here, is because the purpose of this system is to tell you something bad's happening in your head. The purpose is not to go and do something to any particular place. It's the problem of referred pain. It's warning. It has no useful, immediate, functional consequence. So sometimes feels a bit, I tell my colleagues, if someone's telling you about their pain and it sounds a little vague what they're describing, what they're doing is talking to you about activation of cells in the brain, their pathways in the brain. They're telling you about something really very complex. And that's why it sounds woolly, because the descriptions that we have are limited because of the purpose of the exercise. Last thing I want to show you is a little bit complex, but it's to a purpose. If you look at this, we've got good imaging now of the premonitory or prodromal phase. I went through a couple of those things. We have good imaging of when people have pain. It's the structures that are involved when you have pain. I mean functional imaging. We've got very good imaging of what's happening in the aura phase. We haven't really done well imaging the postdrome yet, but that's a work in progress. And we've understood that these various parts of a migraine attack are networked and integrated. So there are rules, but like any good human pastime, the rules can sometimes be ignored and broken because of the way these networks work. We've been fortunate in the last 30 years to have acute treatments, triptans and these GPANTs and monoclonal antibodies that target CGRP. There are nerve modulation methods called neuromodulation that avoid drugs altogether that are available and work, and there are drugs that don't have constriction, and the next big thing is going to be something called PACAP, or pituitary adenylate cyclase activating polypeptide. We're trying to make the names longer. Why not? But the first of the randomised controlled trials for that has just been reported. So if you've had everything, you haven't had everything yet. Which is cool. And then there are things that the people that are going along in the science. And from time to time, something really cool happens, like the CGRP story, and then lots of stuff goes on behind science. You should never imagine that there's no one interested in migraine. There aren't enough people interested in it, that's certainly true. But you should never imagine that there's not. There are people beavering away in laboratories about some of these other things called glurants and rexants and mambalgins, the things that will eventually either come or not come, and some of them will come. You shouldn't think when you have your next attack that there's never going to be any way forward, because there will be. And you shouldn't think that no one believes you've got the condition or think you're crazy people, because we do, and we can image it, and it's crystal clear. And lastly, if You know, some of my colleagues sometimes have been a bit of a pain in the arse about it and not treated you very well. I apologise. We should do better. We don't have any right as physicians to stigmatise your condition just because we don't understand it. And so bear with the clowns, because there are people who are really interested in the problem who want to make your life better. Thank you.